Hi there, I'm Nathan Murphy, and I'm about to have a productive conversation with Mike Vardy.
Welcome to A Productive Conversation. I'm Mike Vardy, and I'm quite excited to welcome Nathan J. Murphy to the podcast. He is the founder and lead researcher at Prepolitica, a research group that takes a science-first approach for the development of political theory. In the past, Nathan has invented, patented, and sold medical products, lobbied the highest level of government for prison reform, founded 3 technology businesses, been a sponsored rock climber, built a large social media following, sold tens of thousands of books, created online courses, renovated a dilapidated house, DIY, and over the past 5 years has been working in political theory, writing academic papers, and presenting at conferences. We talk about his book, The Ideas That Rule Us. And it was a book that I really wanted to dive into. It's definitely a deeper read. And I wanted to steer the conversation towards this idea, no pun intended, that Nathan was fascinated with ideas. So we dive into that. We talk about the idea behind terms and how they can get co-opted and then corrupted. We talk about emotion, behavior. We talk about sovereignty. And is that a word that we really should be using the way that it's being interpreted these days? Like, what does that look like? Old ideas and how they have shaped us and why maybe we should let go of some but embrace others. So much more. So without further ado, let's get to this conversation, and a productive one at that, with Nathan J. Murphy. Nathan, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today and having a productive conversation with me.
Oh, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure and honor to be on your show.
So the book is called The Ideas That Rule Us. And admittedly, when I got the book, I'm like, oh, this is going to be something I want to sink my teeth into, and I'll be able to there's going to be some stuff in here that I can dive into deeply. And there is, but there is, much like an idea, you revisit it and revisit it and revisit it. And there's some stuff that kind of goes over in my head a few times as I was going through the book. And I guess the first question, which is probably a pretty obvious one, is a book not about ideas per se, but about the ideas that rule us. Like what ideas can do to us is something that's rather unique. You hear about the creative act, a way of being. You think about books around ideas and what you do with them, Making Ideas Happen by Scott Belsky. Yeah. But this one, it seemed to me, especially when you start going through the book, is, these ideas that are ruling us may not necessarily be the best things that are ruling us. So I want to get into the nitty-gritty about why you wanted to explore ideas in this way.
Sure. So I guess the inspiration, or at least the backstory to the book, is I was interested in 2 things, partly because of my own life. And I was at the time looking at different directions and what I wanted to do. And I was very interested in understanding, why do we make the decisions we make when there are so many options? So that's just a fundamental question of, where we go, what we do, who we associate with, and all of this. And the other question, which was sort of like at the time disconnected, was trying to understand what is the purpose of art, and what does that role play in society? And when you look at the first question, why do we do what we do? You can't help but start looking at your socialization, the environment that you grew up in, and the values that were embedded within you, and how they took you to where you are today. And probably when you're younger, you tend to act more automatically based on these ideas, which are embedded within you. And usually at some point, you start questioning them. And for some people, they question at a point where it's hard to make those changes. But fortunately for me, I was looking at these and really starting to question this value structure early on. And when you look at the value of art, the value of art is largely about how art, and I'm talking the broadest sense of art, which is film and music and literature, all of these things. It changes society in changing the ideas that people hold, but in a way that can connect abstract ideas to emotional brain.
Right.
So pulling those 2 together, it launched me looking at how do ideas change in society? How are ideas held within us? How what ideas, when behavior communicates values, are there ideas that humans hold which are more or less innate, and how do these biases affect society or the structure of human ideology as a whole? And it just ballooned basically, and it took me some years for it to balloon and some years for me to pull it back together again, because it's obviously a very broad topic.
Right. It's interesting, as I was going through the book, the idea of the emotional ties to ideas. That was one of the things.
Mm-hmm.
As a writer, as somebody who captures everything, it's really hard, I think, especially as a creative, to let go of new ideas that you haven't done anything with, because they come from you, especially if they're deeply tied to, say, the work that you're doing, or even just tied kind of or adjacent to it. And I think I come across this a lot when I work with people too about their tasks, right? They put on, I'm going to do this one day. I'm going to do this one day. And it's in David Allen terms, the someday maybe list when it comes to getting things done. Do you think that the emotional idea, the emotional ties to these ideas, like, are, and I know you talk about the idea of sub ideas and things like that as well, right? Can you give the listener here a way to kind of maybe approach ideas with more reason, or even going further to the other side, more logic, rather than kind of getting captive or captivated rather by these emotional ties to the ideas that we have?
Okay. So I think there's probably more than one way to approach this, but one way we could look at this is if we take a value, and a value is essentially a simple idea, because a value is essentially saying this behavior is better than that behavior, and the future will be better if we behave like that. And an idea at its basis is exactly the same. Now, some ideas or values we hold as information.
Right.
So you could be told something like doing this is better for the environment because X. If we behave like this, the future will be better because of X. Or, we should, do something in our behavior in a different way because that will be better for us. And we can know that is information. But information is essentially abstract information. It's an abstract thing, right? Only when that information becomes held in like an emotional sense will it become like understanding. And understanding, therefore, is emotionally held information. When that behavior becomes so obvious, it's automatic. You don't have to force yourself. It could be like, you want to get fit, you want to go to the gym, and information-wise, you should go to the gym 3 times a week, but you don't do it because you don't actually feel that it's important.
Right.
However, maybe you go through you have a heart condition, and it's because you haven't exercised, you're high cholesterol, and this shock drills that down really emotionally into the core of your being. You're like, wow, I have to go to the gym. I'm not going to die before my kids grow up or whatever.
Yeah.
And now you understand it. And that's the same with many concepts, ideas, and a lot of culture works like this. You could be, you have ideas which are pushed into you as a child, and that's how you see the world. And you go out into the world, and that's how you behave. And these are the values you chase. This is the sort of careers or the work that you value, the sort of people that you value, because those values are embedded. You feel it.
Right.
And when you go into the world, you could have other information, but until that filters down, and it takes time for that to change. So if that makes any sense.
No, it does. And actually, as you were talking about this, you talk about the idea of the abstract versus an abstraction. I talk about this quite a bit too, is that abstractions are that disconnect, right? They interrupt a pattern. They interrupt something that, and you alluded to one right there, which is the idea of, oh, I should go to the gym because, and you found something with greater meaning that makes you feel differently about the situation and your reasons behind it, as opposed to just, well, this is what you should just do, right? It's interesting because I think an abstraction can also further galvanize or validate something that was in the abstract as being something that you should hold on to. Like, so let me give you an example. And not let it become a distraction, because I think abstractions can become distractions as well. So, for example, when I'm teaching somebody to theme their time, for example, they're like, there's no way that I could theme my days and so on and so forth. And then I point out, let's say that they're college football fans. I'm like, well, what do you like watching college football? That's a bit of a pattern interrupt right there. And they're like, well, yeah. So you watch college, when is that on? Like Saturdays, right? And as a Canadian, we don't have the same firmly entrenched sociological, kind of connection to our college sports that Americans do. And Saturday. Okay, so you watch college football Saturday. Yeah. So you try to get everything done so that you could focus on just that, because that's like the day, that's the day you get to watch. Yeah. So you're saying is college football day is Saturday. And then eventually like, I'm like, yeah, you can do that with a day of the week, just like you could say, oh, it's Christmas Day. Well, there's a theme around that, right? So once you do that, then that breaks a pattern that there's no way that I could theme my days, because you could definitely theme some. So it's not, you can go all or nothing. And I wonder if some of the things that kind of tie us to the ideas are also the things that can help us break free from them, right? So like flipping, you talk about this, the idea of understanding the concept of the abstract and its connection to the emotional allows us to go one step further and look at how we can break down. And this is where we get into ideologies, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is it when ideas become so connected to one another that they become this ideology? Can you, in the context of your book, explain what you mean by breaking down an ideology so that you can break free from ideas that either aren't serving you now or never did?
Sure. First, I'd like to just touch on the story you just told.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you might have been doing there as well is you're kind of storytelling them their life, right?
Yep.
And through the story, you're giving them, you're showing them that they already have this like emotional connection of a theme to a day.
Yep.
And then they're like, they get it. They understand now.
Well, they're getting
it's something which is emotionally important to them.
Yeah, it comes back to it comes back to sovereignty over time. Like you do have more sovereignty and agency over time, not in terms of, and that's by the way, that opens a whole bunch of questions, because once you do that, you're like, oh wait, then maybe I could theme. I'm like, yeah, when do you go to bed? Well, that's technically you've themed that time too. Like, so you know there are ways that you could look at this, and it is interesting because a lot of people, they feel like, and you allude to this in the chapter, like time is something that can be very, this is the way we structure time, and like morning people versus night owls, all that stuff. There are certain things. I mean, I've seen articles saying morning people are the most oppressive class out there. And, as a night owl, yeah, they're up there, right? The idea of you need to get up at 5, like all of these things are firmly entrenched so that, and I want to get, once we wrap up this ideology part, is when terminology can become the idea of what it was can be changed by a large group. But let's go into this breaking down of ideologies piece.
Ideology.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, in my book, the easy to reach example is the concept of God. God is a highly abstract concept, and I apologize if you have extremely religious listeners. But in general, there isn't like scientific evidence for God. No one's shown okay, here's God. We can't walk down to the top of the mountain and say there's God. It's a very abstract concept.
Right.
However, it's deeply connected to a lot of people on an emotional level and an identity level. So an ideology connects somehow. It's a structure of ideas that connects the abstract to the emotional. And typically at the top, you have a very abstract sort of concept, say God exists. But to connect that, you need to have a lot of whys or hows. So God exists. Well, God tells us what is right or wrong. God judges us at the end of our life and chooses what happens to us. God has chosen us. We're his chosen people. We're the absolutely best. And all of these things, these strings of concepts which work together, connect us to this abstract idea. And in the end, we can feel so deeply connected to the concept of God that we might sacrifice our lives for it, or spend our entire lives in devoted prayer. And completely fair enough, but that's kind of how it works. So if you want to change a structure of ideas like that, there's almost never any point in arguing about does God exist or not. That doesn't help you.
Right.
You're arguing about the abstract concept, and it's very difficult to ever win an argument because you're arguing about one abstract thing with another.
Right.
If you want to change an idea, you challenge the sub-ideas, the connecting ideas to connect it. So you challenge the idea that there's only one God. Well, actually, so certainly in, say, the UK, There's a lot of pluralistic education of religion, and the concept of God has really, been diminished, or at least one God has been diminished within the UK, or the moral judgment, God tells you what's right or wrong. And within the concept of the church, lots of scandals have made people question.
And the different denominations, the way each of them treat it, like that shows that there's no one absolute way to look at this. So those are the things that are, quote, for lack of a better term, vulnerable than say the firmly entrenched, firmly held stuff. I remember having a conversation with my son about this, and it was just to make him question. And again, I know that some of my listeners are hold religious beliefs, and this is not any judgment. It's just a curiosity. As I pointed out to my son, I said, it's possible that the stories just got more believable, right? Like, you think about it, there are the Greek gods and the Egyptian gods and the Roman gods, and now they're comic book heroes that we celebrate. And, no one would assume that, Thor or Mercury or Apollo necessarily walked among men. And that kind of showed that these were, quote, for lack of a better term, stories that help people, adhere to certain values and, toe the line or whatever you want to call it. And I said, it's possible that maybe they just got better with stories. We need to make something that's more believable for people to go, oh, well, okay. So, he didn't necessarily shoot like lightning bolts out of his hands, but he, turned water into wine or what have you. Right. And again, if you look at it through a critical, if you remove emotion from it, which is, again, very challenging because faith and belief are deeply tied to that.
Connected.
Right. But number one, my son is young, like he's 14. So he's smart enough to understand this stuff, but still curious enough to have his own ideas and be willing to explore them differently, as opposed to somebody who's been, if I was to talk to, say, my mother about this, who said, what do you believe? And I share my ideas. She might go, well, I don't get it. Like, how do you not get this? And so it is interesting because, and that is a great example, because it's so emotionally charged and connected that first off, the state of the person matters too, I think, right? Like the state when you're navigating this, it's the person, because the person is the one that's going to bring the nuance to the whole situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's this way that abstract concepts can be connected to us at such a deep level is also found across all sorts of other aspects of society. In individualistic cultures, you have more or less different reward systems in our brains developed than in more collective cultures.
Right.
And this is basically like ideas, cultural ideas that affect who we become.
Yep.
And to me, that's a really powerful thing. And that's aside from the cultural ideas that drive our environment, which might even more deeply affect like how we develop. For example, if you have an environment which really doesn't look after single mothers or doesn't provide any support, then you have more people in very, very challenging situations, which means much more cortisol in the womb while they're being developed. And those ideas go on to create people who have much higher levels of anxiety or stress throughout their lives, or much harder to emotionally regulate. So these are like cultural ideas that affect people in like this physical way out of their control. And then you have these cultural ideas which just affect the biases of your mind and the preferences of who you are and who you become.
I want to talk about words and terms when it comes to this as well, because I think that and I was literally talking to someone about this yesterday, just the day before we're recording this, is how terms, how they can be initially formed and forged and then introduced can be so co-opted and corrupted over time, right?
Yeah.
And I know we're gonna dive into kind of the idea of, the origins of ideas and how we inherit ideas and some that we maybe should cast aside. But I can't help but think that we live in a world that is more about what's going on right now and then what's going on in the future. And the timeless stuff kind of takes a significant backseat to the timely stuff. And so let me give you an example of we've already alluded to one word that I think has been co-opted and corrupted. And again, once politics gets involved, I think that happens. So the term sovereignty, right? The term sovereign. You go on TikTok and you type in sovereign, you're going to find a
Mhm.
lot of people getting pulled over by police officers saying that they don't need a driver's license and so on and so forth. And you see frustrated police officers, and even the other thing you'll find is court officials that are just like, what is going on here?
Yeah.
And that paints sovereignty, of course, if that's your introduction to the term, or your complete consistent exposure to the term, more so,
Mhm.
then when you hear the term sovereign, you're gonna be like you're gonna have an emotional reaction to it.
Yeah.
To go maybe something little bit more niche is the term inbox zero. The term inbox zero does not mean get your email to zero. It means make sure
Yeah.
that when you leave your email that you have no questions and you're kind of clear. So the
Yeah.
focus shouldn't be processing your email to zero. It should be making sure that when you go back into email, there's nothing waiting for you that you didn't know was already waiting. I mean, there'll be some new emails that come in, but everything that was there is zeroed out and you're not thinking about it. You know what to do when it's there.
Yeah.
But now, not only does it mean your email goes to zero, but it's used as a productivity metric for people to
Mhm.
say, look, man, I was so busy today. I had like 363 emails that I got through. And
Mhm.
again, who's impressed by that? If you're a customer service rep that deals with email, that might be impressive. But if you're a
Mhm.
CEO, or you're somebody who is like a creative that,
Yeah.
had so many emails and it was your job to answer emails. So
Yeah.
what about our attachment to terms, phrases, you can even go beyond that have been corrupted, and
Yeah.
trying to either, because again, this goes back to changing people's minds about it, reframing
Mhm.
it to the way that, I mean, I can tell you every time I talk about inbox zero, I tell people the story. Every time somebody
Mm.
says to me, oh, I'm putting fires out all day long, that's what I felt my day was. I'm like, oh, so you strategically attacked your to-do list. And they're like, no, no,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, that's what a firefighter would do. Like, firefighter wouldn't just be willy-nilly spraying fire. Like they would let things burn to properly
Yeah.
attack the fire. So these kind of, idioms or phrases or what have you, how do you,
Mhm.
number one, break free of them? First off, determine if you even need to. Secondly, break free of them. And thirdly, persuade or educate people on, what these phrases meant in a broader context, or in a
Yeah.
more accurate context.
Sure. So in starting with sovereignty, I mean, obviously the term sovereignty was originally came from the philosophy that you needed someone who was above the law.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and in the Middle Ages, when sovereignty was sort of developed as a concept, is like you needed someone who was above everyone else, and they had the power to make all decisions, because otherwise it would stop. The barons would keep squabbling.
Yeah.
And that's sort of where like modern sovereignty came from. And obviously now where that's, if it's, on TikTok and people are considering it their individual sovereign person and this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Maybe it's an overextension of the term, but how people use things is how they become.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of inbox zero, I feel like that probably is it's been a victim of taking things to like the logical end conclusion.
Yeah.
People, the name is inbox zero. The name isn't inbox
Calm or
like
anything like that.
mind
Yeah.
optimization or something.
It's been quantified. It's been
doing the things that are
quantified.
going to go around your head.
Yeah.
It's like that sort of thing.
Yeah. The objective wins over the subjective.
Absolutely. And a lot of ideologies, a lot of ideas, when people get carried by them, they often drive towards that logical end conclusion. And they tend to go into this sort of like mono ideological space where like everything's around this one idea, and something else will probably suffer because of it.
Mm-hmm.
You might find people who become like obsessively vegan, and they end up being ridiculously like particular, forgetting actually overall, like if you're basically vegan, you're doing all the good you can, but like going that extra mile and being really stressed about, does a fig have a wasp in it?
Yeah.
This sort of thing. Like you can if you get carried by an idea, you can be taken to maybe less useful places.
Intent. I actually, there's this book called The Perfectionists, I think it's called, by Simon Winchester, where he talks about accuracy and precision. And I think that because, and you bring up a good point about inbox zero, there is a precision there of zero, right? Like if you get to zero, that's the target. And what we don't, we really love absolutes, right? We really do. Binary, like this is the way it is. This is how, and again, this kind of goes back to my next question about the origins, like long dead ideas. Like this is the way it's been. This is the way it always will be. And, therefore, like, how dare you change it, and that can come from government documents all the way to, we've always put we've always put the cutlery in this drawer. Like, so why would we change now? Right. Like those kind of things. But you
say that. I
go ahead.
Actually had an argument in IKEA with my partner.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want to have 3 drawers for the cutlery. I wanted a mono drawer. And we had a small fight about it, but the mono drawer survives.
Yep.
And it's much easier.
Well, but that when you're with partners, like, the way we celebrated Christmas when I was growing up, Santa delivered the gifts very differently than he does in our house, right? And it took me a while to, be okay with that, because it was something that, and then I recognized that, and I think this has a lot to do with it, is the security and the stability around that was one of the only things that we really kind of had in our household. So that belief was, I mean, it wasn't foreign. I mean, lots of people did it the way we did it, but it was the time, and my wife and I have talked about this too, where, and again, this is definitely an ideology, is when we go away, I find chain restaurants that we don't eat at because we don't have them here. So we'll go to like Buffalo Wild Wings or, any of these chains, which people are like, why would you go to a chain restaurant? Well, the reason is when we were growing up, it was one of the times where there wouldn't be fighting. If we went to a chain restaurant, everyone kept up appearances, right? And and those were the restaurants we went to. We went to like these we rarely went to restaurants that were not chain oriented. If we found one, then that was fine. But more often than not, it was like, oh, we're going out to dinner. Great. And I was like, this is awesome. We don't need to cook. But also, I'm sure in the back of my head, there won't be any fighting tonight. Like,
It's like a it's connected as a safe space.
Right. And so again, for me, that was and that was an idea that was deeply held until, I was able to kind of go, oh, this is why. And then I was able to break free from, like, I love cooking at home and so on and so forth. Right. So, ideas can be inherited from either, your childhood or from people that are long dead. Look at the, but yet we see some come back, like the Stoics, right? Like Ryan Holiday and Tim Ferriss have definitely been amongst those that have brought back the ideas of the Stoics into modern society. So how do you, like, I demonstrated how I was able to kind of break free of that, like, say, eating out, at a chain restaurant idea. How do we start to kind of work through the process of identifying and deciding which ideas to discard, especially of those that aren't really serving us, either never have or no longer do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably overall, it's not easy. This is why, psychotherapy exists, because you need to, like, ask these questions. You need to examine your life. And I think sometimes you can look at your life and try and, like, one thing to understand always is behavior communicates values. So if you're looking at, you can often believe that you do something a certain way, or that, you believe in a certain set of values, but when your behavior sometimes acts to the contrary, if you're not sure about what you believe, look at how you behave.
Right.
And how does that behavior follow up? And then behind that behavior, when the emotional understanding is different than your knowledge, then maybe there's something behind it, or something that you can improve, or deeply embed different concept. But it takes time, and it's not easy, because you're talking about pathways in your brain which are heavily myelinated, which have become habits or habitual ways of thinking. And to disrupt that is, I think what I would say is, and I think this applies to a lot of self-help things, is you can afford yourself a certain amount of empathy for a lot of these things, or things that you want to change and struggle to change, because it takes time for knowledge to turn into understanding, and often it takes experience to emotionally encode that. That experience could be through literature, through reading, through talking with people, through stimulated experiences, or it can be through actual experience by taking action and doing something the other way. But discovering the ideas that you don't feel are working for you, if you're unhappy with an area of your life, if you don't like the way things are going, you don't like the work that you're doing, you're struggling to be motivated in the work you're doing, that might be a sign that maybe the values that got you there might not be the best for you, or the work that you're doing, or the reason you're working, the values that you're working for. All of these things can come in. But I think like lack of motivation in certain areas, behaving in ways that you prefer not to, they all betray something which underlies like a value structure, or which maybe is something you could examine.
What I also appreciate about the book, and I just got to it, was in my copy here, is the idea of you bringing up some ideological fights that took place. And these aren't small fights. Like, they're not tiffs that you bring up. They're, and some of them are, very literally, as we record this episode, it's a few days removed from our own election in this province of British Columbia that I live in. So not Canada's federal election, but and it was very clear that, first off, no majority government. One party, as of this recording, has 46 seats. They lean left. The party that leans right has 1 seat less, and then there's like a party that leans left that got 2 votes. So basically, like 2 seats. So basically, what'll happen at this point in time is the idea is, if the left-leaning party wins, they'll probably form some kind of agreement with the other party that leans left to form a government that won't necessarily topple. I mean, you understand parliamentary politics, to a degree more than, say, some, because we vote differently. Well, we're supposed to vote differently than America. We don't necessarily do that in Canada. But one of the things that was a big topic was housing. Affordable housing. And in where I live, again, affordable is such a loaded term, right? Because affordable to whom? Affordable where? Affordable based on, my mother was a realtor. Location is the number one rule. I live on an island. The pricing of houses here is much higher than, say, in the middle of Saskatchewan or Manitoba, or, if you're in the American Midwest, right? So why was it important for you to kind of illustrate these fights, and why did you choose ones that, number one, really don't, I don't even have to go number one, that really don't seem to have an outcome? Like, you know what I mean? Like, they don't really, you chose some historical ones, but the outcome is not like, well, this is the best outcome that we could have gotten overall. Like, there's obviously some things in there that didn't quite work out. So why was it important for you to demonstrate this in your book?
So, as a book looking at ideas and ideology, personal and social political, I really wanted to look at a few examples and just say, look, this is how you can visualize them. This is how you can break them down. And this is how we can see things play out. So the housing crisis one I thought was particularly interesting, because personally, I've been affected by the massively ballooning housing crisis. I lived in London for a while, and while I was there, I had a job, I had a good salary. I thought, mostly I've worked for myself, but as you're on a salary, it's much easier to get a mortgage. So I thought, okay, if I'm going to do it, this is the time. And then I looked at what I could buy, and for like the maximum with a pretty decent deposit, maximum borrowing for like 25 or 30 years, I'm just like, it's like a horrible two-bed in house poor, like a stabby place of London, and I'm just like, I don't even want it. How can I do it? So anyway, I left and I just started another business, and I ended up buying a house in Catalonia, in the mountains in the Pyrenees. I could buy it more or less in cash, and I could just build it myself, and it was amazing. But I'm out of it, and that's given me a massive amount of freedom. It's not, if I wanted to have a similar house in London, I need, like, I don't know, in Canadian dollars, probably like 1.5 million Canadian dollars.
Yep.
Like probably on the minimum if I want like a family sort of home. And I'm going to be enslaved to that mortgage. I'll pay it 1.8 times, and it'll be done 30 years later. And it's outrageous. Like if you gave just the way it's structured, and in the UK, we've stopped building like for a really long time. They've made it almost impossible to build almost anything without massive amounts of bureaucracy. And that's like an ideological change which happened post-war.
Well, you've had back and forth. You've had back and forth too between Labor and conservatives too, right? So different ideologies of different ruling parties, which changes the landscape as well. And and in some instances, lack of stability in that role has set you back more than pushed you forward, right? Like, at least in Canada, as much as we had the Conservatives for 10 years, we've had the Liberals for 10 years, right? So, but when you have this back and forth and snap elections and all this stuff happening and crisis in leadership, that can't help either.
I think actually having the different parties in power hasn't actually like helped it at all.
No, that's what I mean. It would hurt it.
On the left, they tend to like be like, from this environmental perspective, no, we shouldn't build things. We shouldn't go into green belt around the thing. No, we should have more control over what big developers can build, all this sort of thing. And on the conservative side, a lot of conservative voters live in nice areas, tend to be a bit wealthier, and they don't want to, they're conservative. They don't want change.
No. Yeah.
And that change has come at a massive cost, an economic cost to society, but it's also come at a huge cost to people, like young people. Now, if like, you know, when I was living in London, the idea of having a family, it's like impossible. I don't want to be a slave. Like, I don't want to lose my entire life for this.
Yes.
I can't do it.
And
a lot of people delay by like an average of like 4 years or something. And for some people, that means they don't have children.
Right. Well, it's changed. And that's the interesting thing. And I know we kind of, I cut you off here a little bit, but the idea of, and I think you mentioned this, the idea of socialization is very tenuous, right? Like the idea of, and I'm forgetting the name of the chapter right now, but I could find it really quickly. But the idea that the idea of culture is a very, it has more of a tenuous hold on it than the superficiality of culture. That's what it is.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So here's an example. And again, we might run a little bit long if that's okay. But the idea of my kids, I can see in them that they're like, the status quo is not quo, right? Like they see benefits to it, but they also are very, they saw, and as a Gen Xer, they basically saw, so for most of the people out there, the idea was get a job, stay in that job, provide for your family, have a house, like that whole like ideal or ideological family structure, nuclear family. And I've thought about this recently, especially as I turned 50, in July of 2024. I was like, my kids are older now. I am now in a position to do more work, but my job was to be at home with my kids, and work was the side thing as opposed to work being the thing. And my kids benefited from that. I benefited from that. And once I reframed that idea, I'm like, oh, so my job wasn't to become this like super successful entrepreneur person, at that time. My job was to be a good dad. Now my job is to still be a good dad, but I don't have to give as much devotion to that. I've laid the groundwork. Now I can focus on the bigger, like this other stuff, because there's still plenty of life, left. But I see my kids have seen, members of my family who have like just worked the grind, and now they're retired, and they're like, okay, so now what do we do? Well, they can't do much of anything because they spent most of their productive years working, and now they're not traveling as, they can't do it and all that stuff. And so it is interesting because you hear the culture wars around like millennials, they're so entitled, they're so this. I'm like, well, there's entitled people in every society. Number one, there's always loafers. I mean, but they may just be really good at setting boundaries, and we weren't. Like, what if that's what if that's it? And you can tell with someone when they're like either so firmly entrenched in this idea that there's an entitlement there, but there's occasionally you get a glimmer like, maybe because it's just a different way of framing being entitled, right? It is. And I wonder if, again, that superficiality that, and you mentioned this, the idea of post-war, pre-war, like going from a resource-based economy to a consumer-based economy, like all that stuff that we're still, I think there is some weird kind of balance that is coming, and it has a lot to do with generational, passing, right? The boomers are becoming outnumbered by the millennials, and the Gen Xers are going to always be the least populous, and that's fine. We're willing to go with whichever way the wind blows. And so it is interesting to see, the idea of housing. What will that look like? I feel like we're just in this really awkward phase of a lot of things right now that is power struggle is not the right term, but it's almost like the transitioning of power, of all of that stuff from the older generation to the younger generation. And there's bound to be friction during that phase. Like, and the boomers experienced it when they took it from the greatest generation. So the only thing is that Gen X never really took it from boomers, really, because there wasn't enough of us. And now we're seeing people retiring that are, boomers, and they're like, well, who's going to fill those jobs? All these housing issues, like, in all honesty, cities typically offer cheaper housing than rural areas in terms of land. Older people, it's weird because older people do need the services that are in urban areas, but they can afford to live in more rural areas, right? Whereas younger people don't need them as much, but they can't afford to live out in those other areas, and they're slowly being squeezed out of everywhere else. So it is this weird, awkward phase that I think is grabbing a lot of attention. Maybe when it shouldn't. Maybe that's part of the thing is we need to kind of go, okay, this is happening. How do I deal with this thing that's happening and still focus on my stuff rather than get caught up and swept up in something that I have less, for lack of a better term, sovereignty over?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing we need to understand is everything is changing all the time.
Yes.
And if you don't change the things that you love, someone else will, and it won't be to your design. So at the moment, especially say in the States, there's a bit of a battle over definition of democracy. There's democracy as a term and what it means. It's changed significantly since its birth.
Yep.
It used to be democracy where the barons voted. Then it was when people who had, over £10 of, cash value and property voted. Then it was men. Then it was men and women over the age of 25. And then it was, and then you had a greater suffrage, and those boundaries are drawn. And sometimes it's with prisoners or inmates or felons or whatever, and sometimes not. But now it's the definition of what is democracy, and that's been fought over. Obviously, in some ways, it's concerning. But then I think again, when we look at the younger generation and they're looking at the ideas that the older generation lived to, they're gonna redesign it a little bit.
Yep.
I mean, the economic structures are still there, so they could be extremely rebellious before they go into the real world, and they might find themselves, adapting a little bit more of a mainstream, idea structure or ideology. But in general, ideas take quite a long time to change. In my book, I look at a bunch of areas of ideological change, and it's like 50 to 75 years. And one thing you really have to think about is if it takes 50 ideas for like fair winds to push an idea to completely change from like 90% adherence to like 10%, in 50 years, half the people you know are dead, right?
Yeah.
Death is a significant part of ideological change. And I think sometimes there's a friction in society because people are living longer. So one end of society is changing at the same pace it always has changed, or maybe faster because accelerated by the internet and all of these technologies that can allow things to change much faster. And the people at the older age range are not changing so much. And then you end up with quite a big separation.
Well, you're
potentially.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing is there's this increased focus on legacy, right? Because people are older. There's this idea of like, what I need to leave my mark. I need to make my mark, right? In whatever way that is. In some ways it's, grand gestures, and others it's just like, I want to make sure that I have enough money for when my kids are, older, and so on and so forth. So you've got a lot of competing ideas and a lot of competing ideologies that some, like you pointed out, some have not changed. And for the longest time, they didn't have to, right? They didn't have to. Talking, my son and I were watching Interstellar the other day. And this is a great example of like science fiction versus like what actually exists now. You watch Interstellar, and one of the things my son brought up was, well, when does this take place? And I go, well, he says it takes place in the near future. And Colton's like, well, what does he mean by that? Because they're driving around in cars that we would see driving around today even, right? And I said, yeah, but think about it. Walk around our neighborhood and you're going to find some Volkswagen Beetles and some Westphalias and those cars are from the 60s and 70s, which is 60 years ago, 70, 50 years. He's like, oh, I'm like, so in 50 years, it's quite reasonable for some of these cars to still be running
Yeah.
even though the people that made them are not, right? Like, there is that, especially cars that, like the cars that they're showing are ones that are not being fixed by computers, but are actually able to be manually fixed by
Yeah.
people. And the look
Hmm.
on his face was like, this is so close to being what we could actually experience. And even the idea of those Marines that are the big giant blocks that, you
Hmm.
know, they are, you might as well, you could insert Chat GPT-4 into them right now and they're pretty, you know what I mean? And some of the way that they were interacting with them, I'm like, yeah, this is much closer. What you can dream up now is not far from what you can create. Whereas back when my parents were younger and they're like, the computers filled entire rooms, and it's funny because my mom looks at her phone and is like afraid of it. I'm like, you used to walk into a room that was a giant computer, and yet
Yeah.
it's the
Yeah.
smaller
Yeah.
computer you're afraid of. She's like, well, yeah, but I don't know how it works and all that. I'm like, it works the same way as your other computer did, just faster,
Hmm.
better, and smaller parts. It is
Hmm.
fascinating that and as we wrap up, a book like this is helpful to read because it promotes critical thinking, and promotes thought around these things, which we don't often think about. And I
Like the
wonder,
background noise.
yeah, like, how do someone who buys the book, which we'll link to in the show notes, where you could start from you could read the book chronologically, like in order. But is there something in there that you think that if someone's never really read a book that explores something that has so many abstract elements to it,
Hmm.
where do you think is a good place for them to start to kind of flip the switch for them? Is it right at the beginning? Is it an area that you had an aha moment where you're like, okay, if this isn't going to get them, nothing will?
So, I mean, I think if you're going to start it, I would start at the beginning because we start quite gently. And I would say it's not it's a book which forces you to think. It's not a holiday read you could probably glaze over with a couple of beers. The point is to make you think deeply and understand things which are affecting everything around you. But I think the thing what I really took out of it, and I think a thing I think about all the time now, is how as we develop the capability as humans to have abstract thoughts, and while we remain emotional animals and our behavior is driven by emotions, but the abstract, which is essentially an unlimited mind, complicates everything and leads for humans, and not so much for other animals, and probably for most animals, not at all. For everything, there's an emotional version of it. So you could say emotional version of wealth. There are abstract versions. And anything that you lean into the abstract, for example, abstract communication, messaging, and whatever, it comes at an emotional cost. The more you lean into abstract versions of almost everything that exists in humanity or in the human sphere, there's an emotional version, and you lean into one and it will come to a cost for the other. And for me, this is like the theme of my future work. And it's for me, that's the deep realization that's came out of this book.
All right, Nathan, as we wrap up, obviously this is a complex and deep kind of area, and, when I'm reading a book or, whenever I get a book of this nature and I see that there is much more to it that you can kind of possibly digest in in one sitting. For example, it's a book that sticks with you, just like the ideas that can stick, with us, those other people's ideas, the things that have preceded us, whether it's, old tropes that we talked about before that have served, or maybe ones that do. Everyone's trying to look for, quote, a quick win, right? I mean, there's no magic pill or silver bullet. But before they pick up the book, or even in conjunction with reading the book, can you give our listeners here something that they can take away today that can help them either leverage the ideas that are ruling us in a better way, or find a simple or quick way out of an idea that's ruling them, that's no longer serving them?
Sure, that's a great question. Thank you, Mike. I think one way we can look at this is we have to accept that we grow up in these value systems, and these value systems might not necessarily serve us in the way that we might hope. And the result of living our lives towards these value systems, we might find ourselves in places or in work or working towards things or living a life that might not really be aligned with who we are on a personality level. So if we find ourselves feeling a lack of motivation for something that we think we should be motivated for, or in a position where we've got everything that we thought we would want, but actually it's not satisfying us, that's probably an indicator that some of our values or the ideas that we're living towards aren't necessarily good for us. And at the end of the day, we can look at our behavior. Behavior communicates values, and those values are the things that we actually hold at an emotional level. And if some of the behaviors aren't necessarily aligned with what we'd like to hold as values, then again, they're indicators that potentially there's something which is a bit of a mismatch.
Isn't it funny that the things that we need to do to kind of, and this isn't just unique in the situation we're talking about with relating to ideas and so on and so forth, but just in general, it often involves taking a pause, slowing down, stopping, thinking about things, where we live in a world that is conspiring to keep us from doing that in a lot of ways. How do you, really quickly, what do you do? What did you do, or what have you done to slow down or give yourself the room, the space, the time to think about these things in the midst of everything else that's going on around you? Because I think that that's an area where somebody listens to what you just said. They're like, yeah, you're right. That's great. But I don't feel like I have time to sit and think about this, and I need to make choices, and I'm willing to sacrifice this area in order to keep moving forward. When we know that if you keep sacrificing in that area, then all of a sudden you wonder how in the world you got to where you are. And it's because you didn't take a moment, a beat, some time 3 weeks ago, 3 months ago, 3 years ago to just go, okay, hold on a second. Let me just take a pause and check in with my values, check in with. So how have you managed to do that? Because I think that's another key to unlocking what you've just shared.
Yeah, I mean, I think personally, I've always felt like, especially not so much now, but throughout my sort of 20s and 30s, I really felt almost in this like constant, or maybe every few years, I just felt this desire to reassess what I'm doing. It's almost like lots of mini midlife crises rather than one giant one down the road. And I think for me, what's most pertinent is to really consider the costs of not thinking. If you spend 20 years building a life that you don't really want, that's a huge amount of effort, huge amount of energy. And sometimes when you get there, it's hard, even harder and more difficult to get out of it or change it. Where it's much better to do that painful work of having a look at it. Is this what I want? Is this like serving me? Am I fulfilled by this direction? Is this right for me? And taking those small, hard decisions along the way to shift and alter course, rather than just end up there and lose 20 years doing something or creating a life which isn't really right for you.
And it's amazing that it doesn't take much time in the moment, but the undoing of it later takes far more time. And that's where the friction can really take hold.
Or you're trapped.
Yeah.
You're stuck in it. You're burdened with debt. You're stuck.
Yeah.
Or you're just so far into career that all your status and everything's derived around it, and it can become too much of a gut wrencher to make that change. I think, as you mentioned, it's quite hard to take that pause. A lot of us have extremely busy lives, and it's hard to think about something without creating a little distance from it.
Yes.
So I think the requirement to, if you can squeeze out a few weeks to abstract yourself from your current life and then look at it with fresh eyes, I think that's incredibly valuable. But I also recognize for a lot of people, that's very hard.
Nathan, the book is called The Ideas That Rule Us: How Other People's Ideas Rule Our Lives and How to Change It. Where can people pick up the book, and where can people keep up with what you're doing?
So you can pick up the book on basically all bookstores. It's available as paperback, ebook, and audiobook. It looks like this. There is someone else about to publish a book under the same title.
Oh, wow. Okay.
and they decided not to do anything about it, but that's life. And you can also follow me on Substack. I have a newsletter which I publish about weekly, about new ideas, new concepts, and future work.
Nathan, thanks so much for having a productive conversation with me today.
Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate it. It was a really great chat.
Thanks to Nathan for joining me on the program today. Of course, you can check out all of the relevant links within the show notes that can be found at mikevardy.com/podcast587. And of course, if you are using an app to get this podcast right now, be it Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, hit the subscribe button to support the show. That way you won't miss a single episode of what's to come, and can also easily search through the archives. You're supporting the show. It doesn't cost you anything. And, that way, you can make sure that you check out all of the amazing episodes that we've got lined up over the next several months. And again, easily search through the archives for the 580 plus episodes that you may have missed out on. Another thing you don't want to miss out on is to check out the sponsors that you heard during the conversation today, because that's another way to support the show. mikevardy.com/podcast sponsors. Click on the link or links that resonate with you, and that way they know that we sent you. That's it for this episode of A Productive Conversation. Thanks so much for taking the time to join me. Until next time, I'm Mike Vardy, the host of A Productive Conversation, reminding you to stop doing productive and start being productive. See you later.